Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. The first thing Jake Sullivan noticed when consciousness returned was that the ceiling above him appeared to be made of crystallized starlight, and the second thing he noticed was that someone was taking detailed measurements of his unconscious body with equipment that hummed like musical instruments. The third thing he noticed, when he turned his head slightly, was that the someone doing the measuring was arguably the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, despite the fact that her skin had a luminous purple hue and her ears came to elegant points that no human ears had ever achieved. "Ah, excellent," she said without looking up from her scanning device, her voice carrying an accent that managed to sound both regal and clinical. "Your neural activity indicates full consciousness recovery. Please remain still while I complete the cranial measurements." Jake blinked several times, trying to reconcile his last memory. His reconnaissance ship spinning out of control toward an uncharted planet, with his current situation in what appeared to be the most advanced medical laboratory he'd ever seen. "I'm sorry, but did I just hear you asking me to hold still while you measure my head? Because I have to say, that's not usually how I like to start conversations with beautiful strangers." The woman, alien, Jake corrected himself, definitely alien, paused in her measurements and looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were the most startling feature in a face full of startling features, shifting from deep violet to bright silver as her expression changed from clinical interest to something like surprise. "You find me beautiful?" she asked, and Jake could hear genuine curiosity in her voice, as if the concept hadn't occurred to her before. "Well, yes," Jake said, trying to sit up and discovering that he was secured to the examination table by restraints that felt more like energy fields than physical bonds. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure if that's relevant given that you appear to be holding me prisoner while conducting medical experiments. Are you planning to explain either of those things?" "I am Princess Valdara of the Xerion Empire," she replied, returning to her scanning with renewed focus. "You are Commander Jake Sullivan of the Terran Space Forces, and you are not precisely a prisoner. You are a research subject." "Oh good," Jake said with forced cheerfulness. "Research subject. That sounds so much better than prisoner. Really takes the sting out of being tied to a table while someone measures my skull." Princess Valdara, because apparently his day was going to include being examined by alien royalty, made a notation on a device that looked like it was carved from a single piece of luminous crystal. "Your sarcasm is noted but irrelevant to the experimental parameters. I am conducting genetic analysis to determine your suitability for the cloning program." "Cloning program?" Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the laboratory's controlled temperature. "What kind of cloning program?" "The kind designed to incorporate beneficial human genetic traits into Xerion physiology for military applications," Valdara replied matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing crop cultivation rather than genetic manipulation. "Humans possess remarkable adaptive capabilities and unusual resistance to environmental stressors. However, your species is generally considered intellectually and physically inferior to Xerion standards." "Gee, thanks for that ringing endorsement," Jake muttered. "I feel so flattered to be considered useful raw material for your super soldier program." For the first time since he'd awakened, Valdara's clinical composure flickered slightly. Her eyes shifted from silver back to violet, and Jake could have sworn he saw something like embarrassment cross her features. "The assessment of human inferiority is based on standardized imperial measurements," she said, her tone becoming slightly defensive. "I am merely following established scientific protocols." "Right," Jake agreed sarcastically. "Established protocols. Nothing personal about it. Just good old-fashioned alien racism dressed up in scientific terminology." "It is not racism," Valdara protested, though her eyes were now shifting rapidly between colors in what Jake was beginning to suspect indicated emotional distress. "It is objective analysis of biological capabilities across species lines." "And yet," Jake pointed out, "you're trying to clone me, which suggests that maybe your objective analysis missed a few things about human capabilities." Valdara opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, looking momentarily flustered. Jake had the distinct impression that she wasn't used to having her scientific assumptions challenged, especially not by her research subjects. The human genetic profile contains certain, intriguing anomalies, she admitted finally. Your species demonstrates remarkable survival instincts and adaptability that our models cannot fully account for. The cloning program is designed to isolate and replicate these beneficial traits. So you're saying humans might not be as inferior as your people thought? Jake asked, enjoying the way Valdara's composed expression was becoming increasingly strained. I am saying that human biology presents interesting research opportunities, Valdara replied stiffly, though Jake noticed she was having trouble maintaining eye contact. Which is why you have been selected for detailed study. Jake studied her face, noting the way her luminous purple skin seemed to darken slightly when she was uncomfortable, and the way her pointed ears twitched when she was trying to maintain her professional demeanor. How long have you been studying humans, Princess? Several years, Valdara admitted, adjusting her scanning equipment with unnecessary precision. I have extensive theoretical knowledge of human physiology and psychology. Theoretical knowledge, Jake repeated. But I'm your first actual human research subject, aren't I? Valdara's eyes flashed bright silver for a moment before settling back to violet. That is, correct. You are the first live human specimen to be made available for direct study. Specimen, Jake said flatly. You know, Princess, your bedside manner could use some work. Most people prefer to be called by their names rather than being referred to as specimens. Most people are not research subjects in a genetic cloning program, Valdara pointed out, though Jake noticed she seemed less certain of her ground than she had been a few minutes earlier. Fair point, Jake conceded. But since we're going to be spending time together, and I assume we are, given the whole cloning thing, maybe you could try thinking of me as Jake rather than as a collection of interesting genetic material. Valdara paused in her work, looking at him with an expression that suggested she was genuinely considering his request. You wish me to personalize our professional relationship? I wish you to acknowledge that I'm a person, not a lab rat, Jake clarified. Granted, I'm a lab rat who crashed his ship and ended up at your mercy, but still a person with thoughts and feelings and a name he's rather fond of. Jake, Valdara said experimentally, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. It is a simple designation. What does it signify in human culture? It's short for Jacob, which means supplanter or one who replaces, Jake replied, then grinned despite their circumstances. Which is probably ironic, considering you're planning to make copies of me. Valdara's eyes shifted to a color Jake hadn't seen before, a warm amber that seemed to suggest amusement. That is, unexpectedly appropriate. Do all human names carry such semantic relevance to their bearers' circumstances? Not usually, Jake admitted. Most of the time it's just coincidence. Though in my case, I seem to have a talent for ending up in situations where I replace what was there before, usually by accident. What were you replacing when your ship crashed on Xerion Prime? Valdara asked, and Jake realized that her clinical tone had softened into something more like genuine curiosity. A boring reconnaissance mission with a much more interesting captivity experience, Jake said. Though I have to say, if I was going to be captured by aliens, I could have done a lot worse than ending up with a beautiful princess who's interested in my genetic material. Valdara's skin darkened noticeably, and her eyes flickered through several colors before settling on what looked like embarrassed silver. Your flattery is noted but irrelevant to the experimental parameters, she said, though Jake could tell she was struggling to maintain her professional distance. It's not flattery if it's true, Jake pointed out. And I'm pretty sure that finding your captor attractive isn't covered in standard prisoner protocols anyway. You are not a prisoner, Valdara insisted, though she seemed less convinced of this than she had been earlier. You are a research subject participating in important scientific work. Right, Jake agreed cheerfully. Important scientific work that involves being strapped to a table while you figure out how to make copies of me. Totally different from being a prisoner. Valdara set down her scanning equipment with more force than necessary, her eyes now flashing between silver and amber in rapid succession. Your continued sarcasm is interfering with my ability to conduct proper analysis. Sorry, Jake said, not sounding sorry at all. I'll try to be a better research subject. Should I flex my muscles so you can get better readings on human physical capabilities? Or maybe tell you about human emotional responses so you can document those too? Human emotional responses are not relevant to the cloning program, Valdara said, though Jake noticed she was paying very close attention to his words despite her dismissal. Aren't they? Jake asked. Because from what I understand about cloning, you're trying to replicate not just physical traits but also the psychological characteristics that make humans adaptable. And emotional resilience is a pretty big part of human adaptability. Valdara stared at him for several seconds, her eyes cycling through colors Jake was beginning to interpret as signs of internal conflict. You are suggesting that emotional factors are integral to the genetic traits I am attempting to isolate? I'm suggesting that you can't separate human survival instincts from human emotions, Jake replied. Fear keeps us alive, curiosity drives us to explore, hope helps us endure impossible circumstances, and humor. He grinned at her. Humor helps us cope with being research subjects in alien cloning programs. For the first time since he'd awakened, Princess Valdara smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face and made her eyes settle into warm amber. Your species is more complex than our initial assessments indicated. Most things are, Jake said softly, surprised by the sudden shift in her demeanor. The question is whether you're interested in understanding that complexity, or just in copying the parts that seem useful. 3 weeks into what Princess Valdara insisted on calling the genetic analysis phase, Jake had learned several important things about Xerion cloning technology. It was incredibly advanced, completely automated, and apparently allergic to human DNA. Every attempt at cellular replication had ended in spectacular failure, leaving Valdara increasingly frustrated and Jake increasingly amused. The molecular structure degrades within hours of extraction, Valdara announced, staring at her latest batch of failed samples with the kind of intensity that suggested she was personally offended by their refusal to cooperate. The genetic material maintains viability during initial harvesting, but begins breaking down at the cellular level as soon as cloning protocols are initiated. Maybe my DNA has performance anxiety, Jake suggested from his position on the examination table, which had become his regular spot for daily testing sessions. You know, stage fright. All that pressure to be cloned for military purposes might be getting to it. Valdara's eyes flashed silver with irritation. Genetic material cannot experience psychological distress. There must be a biochemical factor I am not accounting for in the replication process. Or, Jake offered cheerfully, maybe the universe is trying to tell you something about the ethics of cloning unwilling prisoners for your alien super soldier program. You are not unwilling, Valdara protested, though her tone lacked conviction. You have been cooperative throughout the entire process. I've been cooperative because you've been feeding me excellent meals and giving me a bed that's more comfortable than anything I had on my ship, Jake pointed out. Plus, the company isn't terrible. But that doesn't mean I'm enthusiastic about being turned into an army of genetic duplicates. Valdara paused in her analysis of the failed samples, turning to study Jake with an expression that had become increasingly common over the past few weeks, a mixture of scientific curiosity and something more personal that she seemed determined to ignore. What would make you enthusiastic about participating in genetic research, she asked, and Jake could tell she was trying to frame the question in purely professional terms. Well, for starters, you could try asking instead of assuming, Jake replied. And maybe explaining what you actually hope to accomplish instead of just talking about military applications and genetic superiority. The applications are self-evident, Valdara said, though she looked uncomfortable. Enhanced soldiers with human adaptive capabilities would provide significant strategic advantages for the Empire. That's what you're supposed to say, Jake observed. But is that what you actually want? Because I've been watching you work, Princess, and you don't act like someone whose primary interest is military strategy. You act like someone who's fascinated by the puzzle of human biology for its own sake. Valdara's luminous purple skin darkened in what Jake had learned was her equivalent of a blush. My personal interests are irrelevant to the research objectives. Are they? Jake sat up on the examination table, the energy restraints having been disabled for several days now as their relationship had shifted from captor-prisoner to something more like scientist-collaborator. Because from where I sit, it looks like your personal interests are the only reason this research is happening at all. That is an oversimplification, Valdara protested, but she was avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested Jake had hit close to the truth. Is it? Jake pressed gently. Because I'm pretty sure that if the Xerion Empire really considered humans genetically inferior, they wouldn't be investing royal resources in studying us. And I'm definitely sure that someone of your obvious intelligence could have figured out why the cloning isn't working weeks ago if that was really what you wanted to accomplish. Valdara's eyes cycled rapidly through several colors before settling on a deep violet that Jake was beginning to associate with her being emotionally conflicted. The cloning failures are due to technical limitations, not deliberate sabotage. I didn't say you were sabotaging anything, Jake said softly. I said you're not really trying to solve a problem you don't actually want to solve. I want to solve it, Valdara insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Do you? Jake asked. Because creating copies of me means you wouldn't need to keep the original around anymore. And I get the impression that you've gotten kind of attached to having me here. Valdara's skin flushed a darker purple, and her pointed ears twitched in what Jake had learned was a sign of acute embarrassment. Attachment is not a factor in scientific research protocols. Maybe it should be, Jake suggested. Maybe the reason the cloning isn't working is because you're trying to replicate something that can't be replicated, the specific combination of genetics and experience that makes each person unique. Cloning technology has been successfully applied to numerous Xerion subjects, Valdara pointed out. The failure rate with human genetic material is anomalous. Or maybe it's not a failure at all, Jake said. Maybe it's the universe's way of telling you that some things are better left original. Valdara set down her analysis equipment and turned to face him fully, her expression cycling through frustration, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. You believe that human consciousness is somehow resistant to replication. I believe that trying to copy something instead of understanding it misses the point, Jake replied. You've been studying me for 3 weeks, Princess. What have you actually learned about humans that couldn't be found in your theoretical research? Valdara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. I have learned that human humor serves as both a defensive mechanism and a social bonding behavior. I have learned that human curiosity extends even to their captors, and that human adaptability includes the ability to find comfort in unexpected circumstances. What else? Jake prompted gently. I have learned that human emotional expression is far more nuanced than our psychological profile suggested, Valdara continued, her eyes now settled on warm amber. And I have learned that individual human personalities contain complexities that cannot be reduced to genetic components. And? Jake asked, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. Valdara's expression became vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. And I have learned that theoretical knowledge of a species is completely inadequate preparation for actual interaction with a member of that species. Jake felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, a recognition of connection that went beyond their designated roles as researcher and subject. What kind of interaction, Princess? The kind that makes objective analysis increasingly difficult, Valdara admitted quietly. The kind that makes me question whether I actually want the cloning research to succeed. Because if it succeeds, you don't need me anymore. Jake asked. Because if it succeeds, I lose the excuse to continue. Interacting with you, Valdara corrected, her skin flushing darker as she made the admission. Jake studied her face, seeing past the alien features to the intelligence and loneliness beneath. You know there are other excuses for spending time together, right? Like maybe actually wanting to spend time together. That would be highly inappropriate, Valdara said, though she didn't sound convinced of her own objection. I am conducting scientific research. You are a member of a species under imperial study. Personal relationships would compromise the integrity of the data. What if the personal relationship is the data? Jake suggested. What if the most important thing you could learn about humans is how we form connections with people who are different from us? Valdara stared at him for several seconds, her eyes cycling through colors he was beginning to recognize as signs of internal debate. That would require a completely different research approach. It would require dropping the pretense that this is purely scientific, Jake agreed. And acknowledging that you're as curious about me personally as you are about human biology in general. I am a Xerion princess, Valdara said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. Personal curiosity about alien subjects is not appropriate to my station. What if the alien subject is curious about you too? Jake asked softly. What if he finds Xerion princesses who conduct genetic research to be fascinating, brilliant, and unexpectedly beautiful when they forget to maintain their professional distance? Valdara's breath caught audibly, and her eyes flashed bright silver. Jake. Yes, princess. The cloning research is failing because you don't really want it to succeed, Jake finished. And that's okay. Maybe we can find something better to research together. Such as? Jake smiled at her, noting the way her luminous skin seemed to glow more brightly when she was emotionally engaged. Such as whether a human and a Xerion can create something more interesting than genetic copies. Something original. Valdara's eyes settled on deep amber, and for the first time in weeks, her smile reached her eyes. That would be a completely unprecedented research project. The best ones usually are, Jake replied, and when she moved closer to the examination table, he realized that their research was about to take a turn that neither of them had planned but both had been hoping for. 6 weeks after their first kiss had transformed a genetic analysis session into something entirely different, Jake discovered that Princess Valdara's research methods had become significantly more hands-on. The laboratory had evolved from a sterile clinical environment into something that resembled a combination workshop and private retreat, complete with comfortable seating areas and what Jake had learned were Xerion equivalents of mood lighting. The molecular bonding patterns are still unstable, Valdara announced, reviewing the latest batch of failed cloning attempts with considerably less frustration than she'd shown in previous weeks. Though I'm beginning to suspect that stability was never actually the goal. Still trying to make copies of me? Jake asked from his position at one of the analysis stations, where he'd been helping her document their research findings. Because I thought we'd established that I work better as an original. Valdara's eyes shifted to the warm amber that had become her default expression when they were alone together. We established that cloning human genetic material presents unique challenges that may not be resolvable through conventional Xerion technology. We established that you'd rather spend time with me than with copies of me, Jake corrected gently. Which, by the way, I find extremely flattering. Your ego requires no additional reinforcement, Valdara replied, though she was smiling as she said it. However, the research applications of our collaborative approach have yielded some unexpected data. Jake looked up from the genetic analysis he'd been helping her compile. Over the past month, Valdara had been teaching him to understand Xerion scientific methods, while he'd been sharing insights into human psychology and biology that her theoretical studies had missed. The collaboration had proven more productive than either of them had expected. What kind of unexpected data? He asked. Cross-species compatibility data, Valdara said, her luminous purple skin taking on a slightly darker hue. Our close proximity and regular physical contact have allowed for detailed analysis of physiological responses between human and Xerion biology. Jake grinned at her diplomatic phrasing. Is that what we're calling it? Detailed analysis of physiological responses? Jake, Valdara warned, though her eyes were twinkling with amusement. I'm just saying, Princess, if you're going to document our relationship for scientific purposes, you might want to be more specific about the research methodology, Jake teased. Future xenobiologists are going to be very confused by your clinical terminology. There will be no future xenobiologists, Valdara said firmly. This research is classified at the highest imperial levels. Because of the military applications? Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect there were other reasons for the secrecy. Because of the political implications, Valdara corrected, her expression becoming more serious. Cross-species relationships involving Imperial family members are complicated under Xerion law. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the laboratory's temperature control. How complicated? Complicated enough that our research would be considered treason if certain factions of the Imperial Court became aware of its personal nature, Valdara admitted quietly. Treason? Jake stared at her. For falling in love with a human? For compromising Imperial genetic purity through inappropriate alien contact, Valdara said, her voice carrying bitter frustration. The same genetic purity policies that led to your capture for cloning research in the first place. Jake reached for her hand, noting how her skin felt warm and alive beneath his fingers. So what do we do? We continue the research in private, Valdara replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced this was a sustainable solution. And we hope that the political situation evolves before our relationship becomes impossible to conceal. What would make it impossible to conceal? Jake asked, though he had a suspicion he already knew the answer. Before Valdara could respond, an alarm began chiming from one of her biological monitoring systems. She moved quickly to check the readouts, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something approaching shock. What is it? Jake asked, joining her at the monitoring station. Anomalous biological data, Valdara said faintly, staring at the displays as if she couldn't quite believe what they were showing. The cross-species compatibility analysis is indicating unusual developments. What kind of unusual developments? Jake asked, though the expression on Valdara's face was beginning to give him a pretty good idea. The kind that should be impossible according to every xenobiological model in our databases, Valdara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake, the molecular compatibility between human and Xerion genetics appears to be significantly higher than our initial projections indicated. Higher how? Jake asked, though his heart was already racing with anticipation of her answer. Higher as in, active genetic combination has occurred, Valdara said, her eyes cycling rapidly through colors that Jake had never seen before. As in, despite the failure of all cloning attempts, natural biological processes have successfully created hybrid genetic material. Jake felt the universe tilt around him as the implications hit him. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I am saying that while your DNA refuses to be artificially replicated, it appears to have no difficulty combining naturally with Xerion genetic material when the circumstances are appropriate, Valdara said, her scientific training warring with her personal emotions in her choice of words. Valdara, Jake said softly, moving closer to her. Are you pregnant? That is the most probable interpretation of the biological data, she confirmed, her voice shaking slightly. Though the implications are significant. Jake felt a surge of joy mixed with terror as he processed what she was telling him. Significant how? Significant as in the first recorded instance of successful human-Xerion genetic combination, Valdara said, her eyes now settled on a deep violet that Jake was beginning to associate with profound emotion. Significant as in our child will represent a completely new form of hybrid consciousness. Significant as in the Imperial Court will either consider this the greatest scientific breakthrough in galactic history, or the most dangerous threat to Xerion genetic purity ever documented. And which do you think it will be? Jake asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. I think, Valdara said quietly, placing a protective hand over her still flat abdomen, that we are about to discover whether love is stronger than politics, and whether our daughter will be seen as a bridge between species or as a threat to both of them. Jake pulled her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him despite their different origins. Our daughter. The genetic analysis indicates female characteristics, Valdara confirmed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Though her precise capabilities are unknown, since there is no precedent for human-Xerion hybrid development. Well, Jake said, pressing a kiss to the top of her silver hair, I guess that means we'll have to figure it out as we go along. Together. Jake, Valdara said, pulling back to look at him directly, you understand that this changes everything? Our relationship can no longer be hidden. Once the pregnancy becomes apparent, the Imperial Court will demand explanations. They will want to study our daughter the way I originally intended to study you. Then we make sure that doesn't happen, Jake replied firmly. We protect her, we protect each other, and we prove that what we've created is better than what anyone could have planned or cloned or engineered. Valdara's eyes brightened to hopeful amber. You believe we can convince the Imperial Court to accept a hybrid princess? I believe, Jake said, smiling at her with all the love and determination he could muster, that our daughter is going to be amazing enough to change everyone's mind about what genetic combination can accomplish. She's not going to be a copy of either of us, she's going to be something entirely new and wonderful. Something original, Valdara agreed, echoing his earlier words about the value of uniqueness over replication. Something that proves that the best results come from love, not from laboratory procedures, Jake added, drawing her closer. Though I have to admit, your research methods have been pretty effective. Valdara laughed despite the seriousness of their situation. I may need to revise my scientific approach for future publications. Future publications titled, How I Accidentally Created a New Species While Falling in Love with My Research Subject, Jake suggested. That would be a very long title for a scientific paper, Valdara pointed out. Then we'll call it When Cloning Fails, Try Romance, Jake replied. I think it has a nice ring to it. As they stood together in the laboratory where their relationship had evolved from professional to personal to something that would reshape both their worlds, Jake realized that sometimes the best discoveries weren't planned at all, they were the result of two people brave enough to create something original together. The Imperial throne room of Xerion Prime had never witnessed anything quite like the scene unfolding before Emperor Thaxion and his assembled court. Princess Valdara stood beside Jake, her hand protectively placed over her visibly pregnant belly, while their 8-month-old daughter Zara played contentedly in a specially designed containment field that allowed her to float freely while keeping her safely nearby. The genetic analysis confirms unprecedented hybrid capabilities, Dr. Keelan, the court's chief xenobiologist, announced to the assembled nobles and military officials. The child demonstrates characteristics that exceed both human and Xerion baseline measurements in multiple categories. Jake watched the court's reactions with amusement, noting how their expressions shifted between fascination and horror as they processed the implications of his daughter's existence. Zara herself seemed oblivious to the political drama surrounding her, more interested in making the holographic displays change colors through what appeared to be unconscious telepathic manipulation. She can interface directly with our technology systems, Valdara explained to the court, her scientific training helping her maintain composure despite the personal stakes involved. Without any training or conscious effort, she can communicate with both human and Xerion computer networks. Her neural pathways appear to combine the best adaptive features of both species. And the security implications? General Vrax asked, his tone suggesting he saw Zara more as a potential weapon than as a child. The security implications, Jake interjected before Valdara could respond, are that you now have a member of the Imperial family who can serve as a bridge between species instead of a barrier. Someone who can communicate with both human and Xerion consciousness equally effectively. Emperor Thaxion, an imposing figure whose silver skin and elaborately pointed ears marked him as pure Xerion nobility, studied Zara with an expression that was impossible to read. The child is undeniably remarkable. The question is whether her existence represents an evolutionary advancement or a genetic contamination. With respect, Your Imperial Majesty, Jake said, his tone carefully diplomatic despite his internal frustration, that question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what evolution actually means. It's not about maintaining purity, it's about adaptation and improvement through diversity. You dare lecture the Emperor on evolutionary theory? Minister Yalith demanded, her violet skin flushing with outrage. You are nothing but a primitive human who stumbled into our territory. I'm a primitive human who fell in love with your princess and helped her create something unprecedented in galactic history, Jake corrected mildly. And I'm the father of a child who may represent the future of interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy. Zara chose that moment to babble something in what sounded like a mixture of human language and Xerion telepathic harmonics, causing several of the court's monitoring devices to respond with cascades of musical tones. The effect was both beautiful and slightly unnerving, demonstrating abilities that no one in the room fully understood. "She is trying to communicate," Valdara translated, her eyes shifting to the warm amber that Jake knew indicated maternal pride. "She can sense the emotional tension in the room, and she is attempting to establish harmony among all present consciousnesses." "At 8 months old?" Dr. Keelan asked incredulously. "Hybrid neural development appears to accelerate certain cognitive functions," Valdara confirmed, while maintaining normal emotional and physical development patterns. "She is simultaneously more advanced and more stable than either pure human or pure Xerion children at comparable ages." Emperor Thaction rose from his throne, moving closer to examine Zara more carefully. The child looked up at him with curious eyes that shifted between Jake's brown and Valdara's silver, reaching out tiny hands as if inviting interaction. "She shows no fear," the Emperor observed. "She shows no prejudice either," Jake pointed out. "To her, consciousness is consciousness, regardless of what species it comes from. She doesn't see humans as inferior or Xerions as superior, she just sees people to connect with." "And you believe this perspective could be valuable?" Emperor Thaction asked. "I believe this perspective could revolutionize how we approach interspecies relations," Valdara interjected, her scientific passion overriding court protocol. "Father, imagine first contact situations where communication barriers could be bridged naturally, where cultural misunderstandings could be prevented through direct empathic connection, where Xerion advantages over other species could be compromised," General Vrax interrupted. "Where Xerion advantages could be enhanced," Jake corrected. "Princess Valdara's research has proven that genetic diversity strengthens rather than weakens overall capabilities. Zara isn't a threat to Xerion superiority, she's proof that Xerion genetics can adapt and improve through selective integration." Emperor Thaction studied Jake for several long moments, his expression unreadable. "You speak of selective integration as if it were policy rather than accident." "It doesn't have to remain accidental," Valdara said boldly. "The hybrid program could be expanded, carefully and ethically, to create a new generation of Xerion citizens with enhanced capabilities for interspecies diplomacy and communication." "A new generation of mixed-blood citizens," Minister Yalath said distastefully. "A new generation of superior citizens," Jake countered. "Citizens who combine the best traits of multiple species instead of limiting themselves to the characteristics of only one." Zara began to fuss slightly, and both Jake and Valdara moved simultaneously to comfort her. As Jake picked up his daughter, she settled immediately, her small hand grasping his finger while her eyes fixed on his face with obvious recognition and affection. "She bonds equally with both parents," Dr. Keelan observed clinically. "No preferential attachment to either Xerion or human characteristics. Because she doesn't see them as different," Valdara explained. "To her, we are simply family. The genetic and cultural distinctions that divide our species are meaningless to her hybrid consciousness." Emperor Thaction watched the family interaction with growing interest. "And you believe this perspective could be replicated in other hybrid offspring?" "I believe this perspective could be cultivated in any children raised to see diversity as strength rather than threat," Jake replied. "Hybrid genetics just make it easier to develop that worldview naturally." "The proposal has merit," the Emperor said finally, causing several court members to look shocked at his apparent consideration of such a radical policy change. However, implementation would require careful oversight to prevent genetic degradation of core Xerion characteristics. Implementation would require recognizing that core Xerion characteristics are enhanced, not degraded, by selective integration, Valdara corrected respectfully. "Zara demonstrates capabilities that neither Jake nor I possess individually. She represents genetic advancement, not compromise." Emperor Thaction moved closer to Jake and Zara, studying the child with obvious fascination. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands to hold his granddaughter. Jake hesitated for only a moment before transferring Zara to the Emperor's arms. The child looked up at her grandfather with the same fearless curiosity she showed everyone, reaching up to touch his elaborately pointed ears with obvious delight. "She is beautiful," Emperor Thaction admitted, his voice softer than Jake had ever heard it. "And clearly intelligent. But beauty and intelligence are not sufficient qualifications for imperial succession. What about wisdom?" Jake asked quietly. "What about the ability to see past artificial divisions to recognize the underlying connections that bind all conscious beings together? What about the capacity to communicate with anyone, regardless of their species or culture, and find common ground even in the most challenging circumstances?" "Those would be valuable qualifications," the Emperor agreed thoughtfully. "Those are the qualifications Zara is already developing," Valdara pointed out. "Not because we are training her to be a diplomat, but because her hybrid consciousness naturally seeks harmony and understanding." Zara babbled something that sounded almost like agreement, causing the Emperor to smile despite the serious nature of their discussion. "She does seem to have opinions about our conversation." "She has opinions about everything," Jake said fondly. "Usually expressed through technological manipulation that we don't fully understand yet. Perhaps understanding her capabilities should be our first priority," Emperor Thaction suggested, "before we make any policy decisions about expanding the hybrid program." "Agreed," Valdara said immediately. "I propose continuing our research, but with expanded parameters to include developmental psychology and cultural integration studies alongside the genetic analysis. Research conducted by both parents," Jake added firmly. "Together. As equal partners in both the scientific work and the child-rearing responsibilities." Emperor Thaction studied Jake's determined expression for several seconds before nodding slowly. "Very well. The hybrid research program will continue under royal patronage, with both parents serving as principal investigators." However, his tone became more serious. "The success or failure of this endeavor will determine the future of interspecies policy throughout the Empire. The stakes could not be higher." "We understand," Valdara said, reaching for Jake's free hand. "And we accept the responsibility." "Good," Emperor Thaction replied, transferring Zara back to Jake's arms. "Because the galaxy is watching to see whether the Xerion Empire will lead the way toward a more integrated future, or whether we will cling to isolation and genetic purity at the cost of evolutionary progress." As they left the throne room together, Jake reflected on how much had changed since he'd first awakened in Valdara's laboratory. He'd gone from crash-landed prisoner to research subject to loving partner to father to co-investigator in what might prove to be the most important scientific and social experiment in galactic history. "No pressure," he murmured to Valdara as they walked through the palace corridors. "None at all," she agreed with a smile, her eyes settling on the confident amber that had become his favorite of her expressions. "We are merely responsible for proving that love can create something better than science ever imagined." "Good thing we have such excellent research materials," Jake said, looking down at Zara, who was now fast asleep in his arms, her tiny face peaceful and perfect. "The best," Valdara agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they headed home to continue the most important work of their lives, raising a child who would bridge worlds and prove that the future belonged to those brave enough to create it together.